Voting for the local elections takes place tomorrow. That is Wednesday, June 3rd, here in South Korea. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, June 2nd, here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Now, tomorrow, that's June 3rd, is a national holiday here across the country, of course, as voters head to polling stations to cast their ballots for local leaders. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks, always great to be here.
I also have Professor Lee Hee-eun at Handong International Law School joining this session virtually. Professor Lee, as always, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thomas, we start here in the studio. Korea witnessed a record voter turnout during the 2 days of early voting last Friday and Saturday for the local elections, of course. Let's start with that turnout and the related foreign media coverage.
Sure, yeah. So as you said, the voter turnout was a record. It was 23.5% of eligible voters, and that's around 3% percentage points higher than the previous record for local elections, which was in 2022. That was around 20.5%. So, you know, high turnout, and I think both parties are sort of trying to spin what that means. I think the Democratic Party, you know, the incumbent party, is saying that, you know, it sort of favors, I think generally high early turnout is seen to favor the more liberal or progressive party. And so, you know, the party officials have said it's basically kind of an endorsement of the you know, administration of President Lee Jae-myung, and you know, kind of offering a judgment on the whole martial law crisis and the aftermath of that. At the same time, the People Power Party has been saying that it kind of represents anger against Lee Jae-myung administration, and talking about his arrogance and hubris. They mentioned it, saying it reflected in anger by younger voters about things like housing costs. So trying to sort of sort out what the meaning of it is. You know, at the same time, that previous high turnout voting in 2022 actually led to a low overall turnout. It was only around 50% in 2022, which is like the lowest in 20 years. So it's kind of hard to say, oh, this is, you know, signifies something in particular. It may just be that people are kind of getting acclimated to early voting as part of their schedule. So it is kind of hard to read a meaning into it. As far as the international coverage, you know, I would say it hasn't been hugely, you know, a hot topic of international media. And what has been covered is sort of more focusing, I think, just bigger picture, partly about, is this, you know, referendum on the Lee Jae-myung administration? And I think particularly sort of looking at this election in the shadow of the, you know, the previous Yoon Suk-yeol administration and the aftermath of that, you know, martial law, impeachment, removal from office, and maybe seeing, you know, where does the country stand? Is this kind of, you know, putting a final period on that period, you know, on that era, or, you know, what is sort of, where is the People Power Party going to go in the future? So I think those are kind of the main themes that the international coverage has touched on.
Right. And Professor Lee, before we delve deeper, for the sake of our viewers overseas, could you tell us a bit about Korea's current local elections, including for whom we're voting?
Right. So in context, right, the national elections are going to happen for the National Assembly in 2 years, in 2028, and then we have a presidential election going to happen in 2030. So these are, you know, decidedly local elections. So what that means is, you know, all the major, you know, metropolitan, you know, mayorships or governorships, let's say for Seoul, for Busan, Daegu, or the region where I live in Gyeongbuk Province, right, their elections will be for those officials, as well as for municipal mayors. We're also talking about provincial and metropolitan council member seats, as well as for, you know, the municipal council members. So there are lots of people who are on the ballot here, and there are lots of elections in terms of at the local level. And not only just in terms of the, you know, legislative councilor positions or mayor positions, we're also talking about, you know, superintendents of education, whether at the metropolitan level or at the provincial level. And then at the same time, even though normally we wouldn't have seats for the National Assembly at play, there are by-elections for 14 seats here. So even though the election for National Assembly won't happen in full until 2 years later, this is kind of like a mini general election in that sense because some National Assembly seats are at stake. So I think, just to contrast again, in terms of where we are, this isn't for the National Assembly, for the presidency. This is really sort of elections at the local level.
Right, indeed. And these candidates are out on the political campaign trail today, even as we speak, I believe. Now, political campaigns here in South Korea, Thomas, they adopt diverse and entertaining strategies, if you will, to, of course, secure success. The response to these diverse strategies, however, appears to be rather mixed. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular reality, as well as your thoughts looking in on the situation as a foreign journalist here?
Yeah, so as you said, I think most foreign journalists covering Korean elections do, you can't help but notice the kind of classic colorful routines. There's color coordination among the parties and the candidates. There's songs, like official kind of songs and dance routines. And, you see the people doing the deep bows as you come into the subway station. And these are all sort of like color, bits of color that you can't help but notice. And, obviously also these flatbed trucks driving around the city, these kind of mobile stages, and you can hear, all day long, almost, people doing their campaign little spiels. And so I would say that's one of the sides that has had a little bit of controversy this particular election season. I think there's always that sense of they're a nuisance, they're annoying, they're loud. But this year has also had this kind of, in the midst of, this environmental and energy sort of crisis that we're facing. I've seen complaints about, using these trucks, these idling trucks, sitting there, for stopping and going and starting, and all this gasoline that they're using in the midst of this period when regular citizens are being asked to reduce their usage of driving and reduce their uses of homes. So people have pointed out the hypocrisy of that, and as well as the fact that this is also being subsidized by taxpayer funds. So there's been some pushback against that. I think another thing this season, it's been growing and growing in recent years, but certainly this kind of short form campaigning has gotten much more and more intense and important. So this season, there's really a lot of these kind of 20-second clips that are optimized for TikTok, Reels, YouTube Shorts, and this is just viral dance challenges, funny skits like punchlines, and this kind of algorithmically driven campaigning. And obviously it's reaching a lot of voters where they are, a lot of younger voters. That is kind of their main source of information, are these short form videos. But there has also been criticism about that in terms of just kind of dumbing down the political process, or giving this sense of oversimplifying policy issues. And even some younger voters I've seen talk about, I feel like you're kind of like speaking down to us in a way. And sometimes people have complained about, you're just mocking your opponent, or just even this sense of not really knowing what your policies are. So there's been a little of pushback against that approach as well.
Right, and speaking about policies, Professor Lee, among the pledges made by candidates in the local elections, which ones caught your attention, I wonder, keeping in mind, of course, some of the common concerns shared by Korea's local governments?
Well, I think one of the things that you'll see, I think, across the board from all the parties, all the major parties anyway, is how AI has become really a focal point for many of these campaigns. And essentially what I've seen in terms of the pledges that have been made is that AI is now turning into maybe a universal public service. So every major party platform in terms of the election has really incorporated AI and the importance of it in terms of the national economy, in terms of access of citizens to using AI. So for instance, the opposition party candidate Seoul Mayor Oh Se-eun. He's asked one of his pledges is basically making it available to young people. AI right now is from a cost subscription point of view, it is kind of cost prohibitive for some people, but making it subsidizing it to some degree, so let people and young people particularly have access to it. But also, other people have sort of used AI to sort of think about how this will help, logistically with cities, with respect to the efficiency of services, government services in particular. So, I mean, I think AI has been really one of those topics, which not just, of course, in the conversation, just generally in terms of academics or in other spheres, but mostly in the political sphere now with these elections, AI is definitely a dominant part of the conversation. But also, you're seeing the typical kind of populist measures as well, because a lot of the parties and the candidates themselves have promised, essentially, cash funds directly to citizens. And the claim, the promises that are being made is that if you elect us or elect me in particular, that you'll get cash handouts, and specifically addressing the crisis of fertility in this country, as well as the fact that many people are not getting married and building families. And so the kind of populist response to that would be, of course, let's give money to people to incentivize them so that they can begin families and reverse the trend of this fertility crisis. But then, of course, you also have very locally, unique matters with respect to policies that are specific to a region. So, those are, I think, interesting because they reflect the local attitudes, but the local problems that the citizens are facing in those specific areas. But I think what you're seeing here, generally speaking, is there is this sort of overall view, I think, within the country that we have a major problem when it comes to the overall population of the country. And that obviously, because we're now a super aged society, and there have been recent trends maybe reversing that ever so slightly. I think what you're seeing in the campaign pledges is people recognizing that this is a huge problem. But of course, difficulty there is this is a problem that won't be decided in one election cycle. This requires a measured and thoughtful response. But I think there's the need, at least on the public side, is to say that our policymakers and our politicians are actually responding to this crisis. So I think that's where you see a lot of the populist measures being addressed in this election cycle. But it remains to be seen, of course, where the policy now hits the road in terms of actually addressing these problems at a really sustained level.
Right, some very daunting problems, if I may say so myself. Thomas, meanwhile, there are quite a number of candidates who've also been courting pet owners ahead of tomorrow's local elections. How vital are these votes, according to the foreign media?
Well, it does seem like this kind of pet electorate has become a really important block in this election and probably for elections going forward. I mean, you can see both parties have kind of positions on their official platforms to appeal to pet owners, and we've seen a lot of local candidates also having their own sort of versions of pet related agenda items. And yeah, I mean it's become a large segment of the population. The figure I saw, this is from the KB Financial Group study, said that almost 15.5 million people have pets in Korea as of end of 2024. That's 30% of the population. And they're really also concentrated in some very key areas. They're in kind of these dense urban zones like Seoul and surrounding Gyeonggi province. So they become, I mean, even if you can tip some margins by a few thousand voters because you're appealing to them, that could be really important, especially in these local elections. And they're also kind of part of this a single person household boom. I mean, they speak to this demographic, maybe 20s and 30s voters that are obviously like very important for candidates. And it's something that there's a practical side to it, and there is a real emotional side to it. I mean, for example, in the Democratic Party's platform, they have veterinary cost reduction package as part of it. And just the practical sense of the costs of owning pets. But then there's also promises to enact, this Basic Animal Welfare Act, which is something that's been floating around in the National Assembly for a while, and cracking down on these sort of fake animal shelters. So there's these kind of emotional attachment sides of it, but as well as addressing, just the practical costs of raising pets. The PPP also has some similar items, I think including income tax deductions for pet veterinary expenses. So it seems like it's rapidly become an important voting bloc. I mean, I can see just from walking around town, you can see how many pet owners there are, how many places are appealing, how many businesses and cafes and shops are catering to pet owners. So yeah, it's become quite a fast growing. It'll be interesting to see if, the impact in this upcoming election and probably for elections going forward.
Right, for sure. I agree with you there. Professor, moving forward, what do you believe are the broader implications of the results of tomorrow's local elections for the Lee Jae-myung administration that marks its first year in office this coming Thursday?
Well, if you hear the rhetoric, obviously this is going to be seen as a de facto referendum, right, on the 1 year that he's taken office. We all know that he came to power through a snap election because of the whole martial law fiasco. So he has a full year under his belt. And so now the elections are, I think, a really good way to, so at least at one level, to see how he's doing, right, as a referendum on his policies. So that's certainly one aspect of it, whether there's a victory from the ruling party across the board, or if the opposition party makes inroads in certain places. I think that's going to be, closely watched as people try to discover what's the people's will here and whether the local elections will actually demonstrate that as such. But I think another aspect of this election, which needs to be closely watched, is obviously the regional dimension, because you've had the traditional stronghold for the opposition party, which is in the Gyeongbuk, Gyeongnam region, which is the Daegu areas and Busan, near Busan. And there's been real talk of the Democratic Party making significant inroads. I mean, the Daegu mayoral election there, seems to be relatively close. And if the Democratic Party is able to pull off a victory in that traditional sort of conservative stronghold, I think that will say a lot about the attitude of particularly people in this region about what has happened to the Conservative Party. And in doing so, if there are these inroads into traditional conservative strongholds, like in the Gyeongnam, Gyeongbuk region, then whether or not the opposition party can actually survive, and in this case, maybe not be just a referendum on the ruling party or President Lee, it could also be a referendum on the opposition party in the aftermath of the whole martial law situation. So I think that's going to be something which I think election watchers will be clearly looking for as far as the results and seeing what the patterns are in the electorate when it comes to this result. But also, I think interesting too. I mean, we're talking about referendums here in terms of the parties, but also because traditionally, maybe we have to step back a little bit and say maybe, well, because these are local elections, and the turnout generally is not, of course, as high as the national elections for National Assembly or for president. If you don't see a high voter turnout, although that seems to be, maybe we're seeing a record number, but if it's generally not to be seen as high, then the questions are going to be called into play in terms of whether or not this actually is a reflection of the people's will as a whole. So I think, depending on the results, obviously different people will have different views and to spin it in the ways that they would like to spin it in terms of the politics. But I think it will be very fascinating to see when the election results come out, tomorrow or the day after, where the ruling party has been able to either make inroads into certain places, or where the conservatives were able to hold their position and basically maybe consolidate their efforts against President Lee. So I think that's where a lot of the conversation will be had once the election is over.
Right. And Thomas, as Professor Lee has said, the local elections, it looks to serve as a test of sorts of public sentiment with regard to the Lee Jae-myung administration. I wonder, what have you been hearing on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think Professor Lee broke it down very, very well as to the stakes of this. I've definitely heard, I think people are trying to look for a kind of, I've heard it called the halo effect. President Lee's popularity remains quite high and sort of outpaces, the Democratic Party writ large. I think the last thing I saw from the most recent Gallup poll had Lee Jae-myung at 64% popularity, something like that. So I think, there's a sense of, is that going to lift all boats? And that I think has been somewhat of the, prevailing sentiment. But then we've also seen races getting tighter as we've gotten closer to the election day. And the Seoul mayoral race has, I think, been closer, at least in terms of polling, than some expected. So, I think a lot of those sort of positions are going to be played out on this on this election day, just as far as either is this going to be kind of locking in for the Democratic Party, this governing momentum, and really almost having a much stronger mandate for Lee to push through, or will the People Power Party be able to kind of get a little checks and balances kind of response? Perhaps voters will go for that, or maybe this sense. I mean, they're trying to play up this idea of it will an unfettered Lee Jae-myung administration lead to this kind of unchecked power? So those are some of the things at stake. But again, it does maybe come down to just more local and regional issues in a lot of cases, and just things like economics, housing costs, and those matters. So it's hard to say exactly what to take away at this point, but I guess we'll see tomorrow what some of the bigger picture issues are.
Right, for sure, we will. Professor, we here at Arirang News Center will be staying late into the evening on Wednesday to share, of course, updates about the vote counting after polling stations close their doors. That being said, I wonder personally, as a scholar, what will you be focusing on with regard to the results of the election?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, I think the regional pattern will be fascinating to see because, again, there's been a lot of talk about the Democrats making some, basically efforts to take over the conservative strongholds. And if President Lee is that popular and really can they ride on his coattails when it comes to being elected to office in these places where conservatives have dominated? But also when it comes to local elections too, you're looking ahead to the national elections, because a lot of these people who get elected, especially in the governorships, in the mayor positions, especially at the metropolitan level, these are all future presidential candidates possibly. I think depending on the size of victory and who's able to consolidate their bases, but also achieve victory, I guess puts them in a better position to potentially think about national office. And so I think the local elections here could be a bellwether with respect to specific individuals and their political fortunes going forward. So I think that's what I'll be looking for specifically, is seeing who wins, who loses, and then whether or not this will have any indication for the next 2 years, the next 4 or 5 years when it comes to the election for the president. So I think we're looking at the president, obviously, in terms of what this will mean for each of the parties, the ruling party and the opposition party, but also I think looking ahead in terms of the future national elections, who will come out as leading candidates from either side.
Right, indeed. And those are the thoughts of Professor Lee Hee-eun at Handong International Law School. Professor, as always, thank you so much for your insights.
It was my pleasure.
And Thomas here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, that ends Press Perspective for today. We return same time on Thursday, as tomorrow is election day here in South Korea. Thank you for watching.